Okay, I think you can go now, Emma.
Hey, hello to our audience and welcome to our guest for today's salon. My name is Emma Park and I am an assistant professor in the Department of Historical Studies at the New School. And I have been a member of the Platform Economies Research Network, or PERN, since our colleague Janet Reutman launched the initiative, I believe in 2019, is that right? Something. So holding in abeyance any certainty regarding what platform economies are, and perhaps even more pressingly, what they do, at PERN we inquire into their socio-technical bases. So we're very excited in that regard to welcome today's guests. Of particular concern to our group, I think, over the past few years has been the question of valuation. That is, by what material, discursive, and regulatory processes, though these domains perhaps cannot be so easily separated, are data rendered value, and value of what kind? I will first introduce our speakers and then move on to introduce today's moderator. Today, we are here to discuss Salomé Viljoen, Jake Goldenfein, and Lee McGuigan's paper, Design Choices, Mechanism Design and Platform Capitalism. Salomé is an academic fellow at Columbia Law School. She is also a former fellow and current affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Salomé's current work is on the political economy of social data. This work explores how law structures data production and downstream uses of data-intensive technologies, and as well how law might be transformed to facilitate more egalitarian data production. Jake is a senior lecturer at Melbourne Law School. He has held research fellowships at Cornell Tech, New York Law School, and the Swinburne Institute for Social Research in a variety of fields: media and communications, history and theory, intellectual property, communications policy, and privacy and media law. Lee is an assistant professor in the Hussman School of Journalism and Media at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Previously, he was a research fellow at Cornell Tech's Digital Life Initiative. He studies the history and political economy of advertising, media, and information technology to examine knowledge infrastructures and logistical processes in the advertising and media industries. So welcome to three of you, and thanks so much for joining us. And today's discussant is Fabio Mattioli. Fabio is a senior lecturer in social anthropology at the School of Social and Political Sciences and associated researcher at the Center for Artificial Intelligence and Digital Ethics at the University of Melbourne. His research analyzes how society is shaped by new economic and technological innovations. His recently published book, Dark Finance, Illiquidity, and Authoritarianism at the Margins of Europe, offers an ethnographic account of financial expansion and its political impacts in Eastern Europe. So with that, I pass things over to you, Fabio.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you for pronouncing the very mouthfulish kind of title that I have these days. Look, I think I would love for the authors to take about 10 minutes to situate their work and say a few words about where they're coming from, how they came to this research, and what they see as the significance of it, or anything really that you want us to have as a context for starting the discussion. And then we'll kick it off in terms of a conversation, really. So I invite everybody to unmute themselves and then jump off. I have a lot of questions because your paper was so stimulating and really helpful in thinking about mechanism design and what is behind some of the dynamics of pricing and markets created by social media. So lots of things to think about. So I'll try not to manipulate the conversation too much, but definitely, we'll try to keep it open as much as possible. So over to you, folks, for about 10, 15 minutes to lead us into the conversation.
We didn't really choreograph an order of operations here, so we're winging it, which hopefully will be dynamic and not clumsy. I guess I can start on how we got began the project, which was that I had seen a call for papers for a special issue of a journal in communication and media studies that was on optimization. And so Jake, Salomé, and I were all at Cornell Tech at the time, and we had a lot of fun talking to each other. We had lots of shared intellectual interests, and we had talked about trying to write something together. And so this seemed like a great opportunity to do that. At which point, Salomé and Jake said we should write about mechanism design. And I said, what's mechanism design? And then they explained it. And then I said, what's mechanism design? And then they explained it again. And eventually we got around to starting work on this paper. Does anyone else want to take the baton and advance from there, how we evolved into this particular topic?
Well, I'll just quickly insert that in between Lee asking Jake and I what mechanism design is, we kept insisting to him that everything that he was extremely expert in could in fact be understood as mechanism design. And I think that's a little bit at the heart of the paper and at the heart of this piece, is that we're sort of trying to say that a lot of what people are up to when they're studying the digital economy and studying digital platforms is studying the kind of end result of a particular intellectual tradition and a particular intellectual technology. So yeah, the conversations themselves, I think, influenced the paper quite deeply, even at that early stage.
Salomé, maybe if I can just ask you then, where does it start and where does it stop in terms of mechanism design? Because what you describe is this fascinating set of assumptions and then algorithms that go into it, and then you just say, well, a lot of things are actually mechanism design. So maybe it would be useful if you just could tell us, where does it start and sort of where does it stop in the sort of social media platformy cases that you have thought about?
Yeah, I will attempt an answer to that, and then I might also make Jake talk because I think he has smart things to say in response to that question too, and hasn't spoken yet. So yeah, I think for me, it's maybe more useful to think about it less in terms of like drawing a boundary and saying, so far, this is mechanism design and no further, and more thinking about it as like aspects or lenses or sort of like intellectual traditions. So I think that, as an intellectual tradition or as I think Jake maybe it was Lee inserted the phrase like an intellectual technology of mechanism design is a way to think of what a digital platform is. And it comes from a very particular genealogy and a very particular lineage, which we trace in the paper. So I think you can think of all digital platforms as they're engineered and designed as products of mechanism design, and you can approach them from the perspective of mechanism design. And when you speak to mechanism designers, it's not quite, I think, like, I don't know if I've quite extended the phrase of a worldview, but they really do think about a lot of problems in the world, like a lot of social problems that we face with the intellectual apparatus of mechanism design. So I think what we were interested in getting at a little bit is like, what is this intellectual apparatus? Why has it found such purchase in the context of digital platforms, and where does it come from?
I'll just add a couple things real. I'll just jump in real quick since I probably can't stay here for too long. So, I mean, one of the things that's fascinating about mechanism design is that proponents sort of present it as this generalizable toolkit for making optimal decisions. And in that sense, it's similar to, other traditions we think of like cost benefit and general like systems analysis and management sciences and all these mathematical optimization sciences that make promises about perfecting decision making under certain conditions. But it carries with it, mechanism design carries with it some of these like really particular commitments and promises about what it can do. So it's very activist and like it's an engineering model of trying to achieve these outcomes. And it also portends these claims to have these certain ideological and normative bases about what it's accomplishing, about like social welfare, about a commitment to autonomy of decision making and the rationality of agents, supposedly. And so those are some of the things that make mechanism design a specific version of the broader like rationality project that other historians have described.
I think that connected to all of those ideas is the way in which the intellectual tradition, which has received so many accolades, Nobel Prizes again and again, then gets leverage to legitimize and authorize a whole suite of practices that are and aren't so connected to the intellectual project that itself, you know, however you might feel about it, that itself receives these accolades. So we sort of describe, you know, as we were doing this work, we weren't sure how to describe the relationship between the computational applications of mechanism design that power these markets and platforms, whether we should think about it as like a slippage away from the sort of intellectual sort of Platonic form of mechanism design, or rather, and through Morawski and Nikar's work, really understand it as this internal contradiction between different schools and different practices that fundamentally sort of troubled and complicated the ideological commitments that Lee pointed out before, although that, you know, rarely seems to get, or certainly doesn't get unearthed in the legitimizing discourse around the use of mechanism design. And to that end, you know, another prompt for us to write this work was we were responding to a general sort of a commentary that we were hearing, you know, when we were in New York together about ideas like mechanism design for social good. So we were responding to these particular claims and these particular deployments of that intellectual lineage. In fact, an earlier title of this work was Mechanism Design for What?
That is such a fantastic title. I almost wish you had kept that one.
Maybe slightly too antagonistic, I think.
That is a good point. So do you feel that this is part of the general feeling of designing or, you know, like user-centered design for public good, for anything, right? Which in fact has all sorts of other practices within it, but then is used to legitimize a certain trend in, you know, engineering taking over the rest of the world, so to speak, because it's okay, because it's user-centered. Is that same thing? It's sort of a buzzword that it really covers different kind of power relation being rolled out thanks to data, regardless of what actually goes in there.
I mean, I think that's a really interesting question, in part because it gets to the tension that Jake was describing between these competing philosophies within mechanism design. One that claims to deeply respect the autonomy of agents, and so you might think of that as being like a user-centric version, and then the more computational and experimental variant that doesn't particularly care about individuals and their rationality and preserving the conditions of rationality, but more about just like through brute force figuring out the correlations and patterns that achieve the outcomes that are desirable, right? And so I do think there's a sense that, in a sense, it's presented as being user-centric, and yet on the computational side, it's emphatically not, particularly if you look at the ad tech platforms that we were talking about in the ways that, and in the time we were writing the paper, there were disclosures about collusion between Google and Facebook that are precisely the reverse of the claim that they are maximizing social welfare to the benefit of the entire market through this apolitical form of optimization. It was exactly, you know, it's decidedly suboptimal and greedy and political, and so totally different than the smokescreen that's presented about being a user-centric form of design. But the two things need each other to legitimize each other and to work in the world as cultural forces as well as technical apparatus.
Yeah, I think that story of like structure and legitimation and the hopping between the like clean applied game theory Nobel Prize winning aspect and the like brute force operational aspect was something that kept coming up as we were figuring out like, is this a slippage? Is this a twin genealogy? Is the emphasis on mechanism? Is the emphasis on design? It really does have this back and forth and productive tension between the two.
And I suppose that in looking at that, we necessarily fall into a process of philosophical historical narration as well. I think unavoidably we place ourselves within a tradition that looks at the deployment of ideas of autonomy as cover for a form of exploitation. And you know, in the work that we've done subsequently, we see that again. And so that's kind of in the background as well, although we sort of didn't press that angle in this paper at all.
Could I just actually jump in to say, like, I mean, I was just thrilled. This is a very, very dense piece of writing. We all sort of agreed about that in our exchanges before this meeting. But one of our goals, one of the reasons we started this, Emma, I can't remember the date, but it's like because COVID days, you know, but whatever. We've been together for 4 or 5 years. Was really the fact of, you know, there has been probably a decade, I don't know, of writing, maybe more, on you know, Google, Facebook, that whole ad economy, the platform ad economy. And when I read your piece, I was like, why haven't I learned this before? like, you know, people do refer to the auctions, but it's like just such a it's such a gloss. Like, where have the social scientists been? You know, so for me, this was like, I learned a lot. I mean, it's a very challenging piece. Luckily, I did a course on collective action when I was a master's student 100 years ago. That was very helpful. But yeah, so I learned an immense amount, and I think that it's you say this at some point that like I can't remember how you put it, but like the computational adaptations of mechanism design, what we're calling automated mechanism design, has gone sort of without scrutiny. And so one of my questions is like, why? I mean, I don't think you have an answer to that, but that's really surprising. I think it says a lot about the way our research projects and questions are formulated, which is really problematic. So thank you for, you know, kind of, as you put it, like, I think you said, like, pulling back the curtain of platform capitalism. You know, it's like actually become a terrible gloss, that term. So yeah, I guess one of the questions I had though comes of this question of optimization. Again, for me, like I was so thankful to have someone like walk me through the process of optimization in this particular ad tech setting. And so I'm paraphrasing a little bit. It's somewhat for the benefit of people who are with us online, but so you show in this article like how automated mechanism design, and correct me if I'm saying anything wrong, kind of expands the project of establishing automated, what you call automated market-like institutions to coordinate social choices and allocate value across more and more settings, right? So this is like, right? So, and while at the same time, it's the shift, I think, that Salomé, well, and all of you just referred to, like abandoning the alleged normative commitment, right, to autonomy, individual autonomy, and rational decision-making, right? At least theoretically, there's that normative commitment, right? I mean, I guess as an economic anthropologist, I'm like, that normative commitment always gets compromised. Like, that was sort of one of my, like, the great thing is that you've looked at the pragmatics of when the model goes into operation, right? This is how value gets produced, and this is how resources get allocated, and this is et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that was, yeah, again, extremely welcome. But I guess I wondered if it's like, is it surprise? I mean, it's sad, but is it surprising that the normative commitment is compromised? And I guess my question would be, and you don't have to have a straight answer to this, but like using Morawski and Nika's kind of dehumanizing markets, like this is an example of dehumanizing markets. Like, I felt like you describe and illustrate really this really important shift, but we just had a whole online session, in fact, with Florian Jaton on ground truthing, right? And so just a little, very briefly, I'm sorry I'm going on here, but that involves like a set of choices to establish the ground truth. So choices like this, not that. Very simple. And those are operationalized, and those are human choices, right? So my feeling is like, what is optimized is one set of values regarding what's efficient. That might be social welfare. That might be Google trying to set prices, right? Like that's what they think, or whoever's designing this, the engineers, et cetera. And so I guess my point, this is very much the anthropologist speaking here, but is like there are varying conceptions of efficiency or what's optimal. And so if that's the case, is it relevant really to talk about dehumanizing? Like, I think you sort of like, it sort of undermines the power of what you showed us, right? Like there isn't really a pathology, because like what would design, I guess this is the question, what could design optimization, or what would be a practice of design optimization that renders a non-pathological outcome? Like, what would that look like? You know, I literally can't conjure it. I guess it's Florian's point that like all ground truths are biased. They're just different, you know? So that's sorry, I'm going on here, but that I was fascinated by all of that. And if you have comments, great. And if you don't, that's fine too. But that's sort of my first question.
Lee, I know you have to drop off. Do you want to we'll always give you first, right of first refusal for the lawyers out there.
But you two probably have more smart things to say. I mean, I guess the one thing I'd say, and I think the other two will have more sophisticated answers to this, but one of the things that I take away from looking at mechanism design is that it pretends it's not politics, but it is. And some of Murawski's work shows this very clearly in looking at auction design for the telecommunications spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum, which is like a classic case, Nobel Prize winning. Look at this elegant and undeniably beautiful thing we built to allocate value so efficiently according to our definitions of what that means. But actually what it was that, telecom companies hired auction designers, lobbied for changes and all these sorts of political aspects that get sort of washed away. So, I mean, I totally agree with the point that like all these ground truths are someone's choices about what we're going to optimize, or like what's efficient means, what optimization is going to mean. And I think, mechanism design, like other sorts of rationalizing sciences, is fascinating because it pretends to do away with that, but it doesn't, right?
Yeah.
I mean, as far as the dehumanizing and the simulating of markets, I think probably Jake and Salomé can speak to that a little better than I can.
I mean, on this normative point, I'm with you, Janet, that there's always this prompt that the ideological commitments are always dispensed with very quickly. But there's always, the question of why is, as Lee points out, like this political question. And I think there's value in trying to unpack why in each case those commitments are abandoned. And for instance, I'm thinking through like the outputs, we're in Australia and we had this digital platforms inquiry and we have some of these outputs coming out of it. A recent one is this draft Online Privacy Act, which is, effectively framing privacy law as the solution to the market failure in the data market between individual consumers and platforms. And the solution it proposes is absolutely nothing other than new transparency requirements. So all through these outcomes, in every regulatory effort that has come out of this digital platforms inquiry, there is this fantasy that by fixing these little market failures, that by recuperating efficiency in the market between platforms and news producers, between platforms and advertisers, between platforms and consumers, we're somehow going to achieve the efficient outcomes of that the platform world has promised us. And I do think that the regulators are operating more or less in good faith. But why do they think that tweaking these particular, like searching for these particular efficiencies is going to produce an outcome that they would deem desirable? Like, so that to me is the question why. Why do these fantasies of autonomy, rationality, and as a product market efficiency keep being deployed when they clearly don't work and they clearly don't have purchase on what is the primary set of concerns that I think don't get unearthed because perhaps they're too political. So this, I'm with you. Like when you build your market, you throw this stuff out, but there's something more complicated going on.
Yeah. Okay, there's so much to react to. So on your very first point, just being like, wow, mechanism design, why haven't, I'll just say this is like a quick plug of why places like the DLI are great, because we're a little island of like social theorists among a bunch of people who just straight up do mechanism design. So it's just really hard to ignore that, like, when engineers and computer scientists talk about auctions, this is the method and the language they're using to do that and talk about it. And that's hard to ignore at a place like DLI. I mean, Jake and I had both separately already been doing work on mechanism design before we showed up there, but a place like that where you're just kind of like embedded around these folks makes it surprising. And so I don't know, maybe that's just a meta comment on like disciplinary siloing in the social sciences, that we're like using very different intellectual technologies and like ways of talking about the same phenomenon. And it's interesting to peek over and see like, how are the engineers talking about this? Especially if you're studying their products.
Exactly.
So on the normative shift thing, I also totally agree with everything that's been said. I guess particularly for me as a legal scholar, I'm really interested in where those things get dispensed with, even if they are consistently dispensed with, because our legal regimes grant a certain deference to markets, and we devolve certain social allocative, sort of interpersonally coercive distributive decisions to markets on the basis of certain assumptions that are backgrounded by law, by democratically, in theory, democratically accountable law. And so that assumption informs the theory of the state that a lot of legal scholars have. I mean, to Jake's point, I mean, I think plenty of legal scholars and other scholars will be like, the state is there to solve the problems that the market can't, which is a weird theory of the state. I don't share that theory of the state, but that's a very common one. But that implies a certain theory of what markets are up to. So for me, it's still really useful to say, at what point is this market-like mechanism meaningfully departing from markets in legally relevant ways, like in ways that legal scholars have to revisit and say, like, well, hold on a second. All of those deferential sort of attitudes we have, all of the reasons that we devolve allocative decisions to this mechanism don't maybe apply here anymore, or ought to be revisited. And so that's kind of my enduring interest in like a thing that continues to show up basically all the time. And I guess I'll just close with like, something that you touched on at the beginning of your comments, and that Jake and Lee's comments touch on too, which is to say that like in those historical conversations about auctions and up to this day, there's a really interesting kind of power to mechanism design being offered up as this ideological compromise. So I think a slightly more sophisticated read is to say, oh, we know that technology and these choices are political, but there's something that we can do that's more sophisticated, that's like a best case compromise between like the central state planner and the like laissez-faire market, and that is mechanism design. It combines the best of the two worlds. And that story of ideological compromise, I think is extremely powerful. And has endured for decades. And I find that really interesting.
You can go on.
Can I quickly jump in there? I really enjoyed your paper. I think it's great. And fascinating and detailed, and provides, it's illuminating at the same time. So it's, one of my favorite types of papers where you're able to learn something and get some really interesting insights as well. I just want to follow up on, Salomé, what you were saying there, exactly about that kind of compromise. So when it comes to mechanism design, and maybe I read this a few weeks ago, so maybe I've just forgotten, but when did mechanism design, sort of automated mechanism design, sort of take off and become a increasingly deployed technology, socio-technology, whatever you want to call it? Is there a chronology to this that we can kind of identify a shift in the deployment of these, automated mechanism design that reflects on what you're saying about this compromise between markets and the state, that, you can see it kind of take off around 2010, or is it before that, or is it 2015, or is it even back in the 1990s where you start getting this sort of thing going? I'd be really fascinated to I get a sense of that kind of history, chronology, whatever you want to call it.
A good question. I mean, I suppose the chronology of mechanism design that we understood was what we could take from effectively reading mechanism design textbooks, and then textbooks on automated mechanism design. And it is kind of complex to draw the kind of conclusion that you're asking for from that. But there was definitely in the 1990s a lot of interest in the application of mechanism design to what were understood to be very massive coordination problems posed by the internet. And I think that we kind of suggest briefly in the paper that those applications of automated mechanism design hewed more closely to the sort of game theoretical story. But then as these processes started taking on more of the domains that were perhaps the world of like operations research, they started to take on more of that kind of optimization character, which is a somewhat different kind of coordination problem and potentially more connected to the kind of applications in platforms that we describe. Lee spent a bit of time looking at this. Lee is a historian of technology in the advertising industry, so he might be able to offer some more detail.
So a little bit following the chronology that Jake was talking about of things like dealing with spam and routing on the internet and some of these problems. In the late 1990s, some of the online search engines start selling advertising via auction. And this is, Hal Varian from Google calls this the poster child for automated mechanism design, these search keyword auctions. And so, that starts up in the late 1990s, and fairly early on, Google makes this a step by adapting the generalized second price, what it calls the generalized second price auction. And here, this is an interesting case because there's a couple of dynamics going on. So, the game theoretic tradition talks about auctions and how they have these properties that are supposed to do things like incentivize truthful disclosure of one's values that are important for allocating opportunities and assets in a way that's going to maximize the value across all the participants involved, right? And so Google takes the Vickery auction, which has these properties of truthfulness and all the rest of it. But one of the problems that it runs into is that it has to explain to customers and clients how it's pricing. And that becomes a little more complicated than just saying, well, we're just going to give it to we're just going to use the second price auction. We're going to dispense with some of the properties of the Vickery auction, which has to do with basically determining a price based on the opportunity cost imposed on other participants in the auction, right? That becomes a more complicated story to tell the media buyers and who are concerned about how this is going on. And so they make these adaptations on this auction format that basically dispense with these properties that are supposed to preserve the integrity of the mechanism design. It stops being, it stops having an equal, I don't have the technical memory right now, but it doesn't have the incentivizing truthful disclosures. It creates potential problems. It doesn't have the same equilibria as a Vickery auction would in theory. And so that's just like an example of how there's incentive compatibility. Thanks, Salomé. Some of the practical issues of deploying it in the wild in a particular industrial context affected turned this abstract design into something that had to be put into practice and change what it was to a certain extent. And then, if you follow that all the way to the platform advertising of today, one of the, I think, most interesting things about them is that the promise of them is accountability of look, we have basically perfect record keeping of every transaction, of all the serving logs and all the rest of it, and yet it's totally unaccountable, that nobody can vet the claims. And so the ability to mess with a mechanism to your benefit becomes really hard to uncover, which is another way that that the automated mechanism design can depart further from its supposed normative commitments in practice in these markets.
Although that does seem to have become a particular preoccupation with regulators now. For instance, we have the ad tech inquiry in Australia, and in the US, I think it's in Texas, that there's the action against Google where they're looking at precisely these environments where Google is, bidding up its take in ad tech, etc.
The accusation it's using, as far as I understand, the accusation it's using a second price auction for selling and a third price auction for buying. Is that right? And then it's cashing in the middle. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and then they're milking the gap.
Yeah. Sorry, can I follow up on that if no one else is? So following up from that, what's interesting to me is the second thing that I found really interesting is this whole notion of truthfulness, lying, things like that, trying to get people to be more truthful, and the notion that being more truthful would lead to greater welfare. And there seems to be a kind of, like you've already pointed out some of these issues, but there seems to be this kind of not contradiction, maybe, I don't know what it is, a conflict between the current kind of consumer surplus that we benefit from lying, and if we don't reveal all our truths and preferences, then we benefit from that, while the claims that this kind of automated mechanism designed to reveal our truthful preferences will actually lead to better welfare outcomes. But actually, that seems to contradict the consumer surplus that we have from not revealing the true things about ourselves and hiding things and lying and so on that actually can be very beneficial to us. And so there's this that seems like a really interesting political, ethical conflict that I don't know what you call it, normative conflict that seems to reflect the claims about the benefits of it versus the actual benefits of it, I guess. Yeah. I don't know if that.
I think that an instance of that is revealed again in some of these inquiries into Facebook and Google and their malfeasance in the advertising markets, which is that the presumption of mechanism design is that the participants whose choices you're trying to orchestrate have private information that's unknown to the mechanism designer. And so it's the mechanism that brings that forward without coercion. And yet what the platforms have been found to do, quite deliberately, I think, is to profile the people in the market such that they can better know and predict and potentially manipulate the private values that the participants have. In this case, the participants being publishers and advertisers. In the case of, Facebook, Google specifically, I think in the Texas report.
And I guess to introduce a little wrinkle here, both of those instances are the operationalized form, departing from like what the theoretical tradition would say like satisfies the points and then an appropriate application of mechanism design. So in an idealized or theoretically ideal formed mechanism design, what incentive compatibility is getting at is that like we're designing a system where the information that I reveal is beneficial for me individually to reveal, and also leads to like a sum beneficial outcome for the entire all the participants in the coordination problem. And then, in the theoretical tradition, people will go to great pains to make sure that like alignment with like, I truthfully reveal, and that leads to everyone getting like the sum total best allocation of like, I like order my favorite candy bars, and like, if I really like Twix, I'm incentivized to say that I really like Twix. And, if someone really likes Twix even more than me, then like they should get the Twix. And like I get, I don't know, Milky Way. And like I'm incentivized to tell the truth. And we like end up with like a sum total best allocation of consumer welfare in the like candy coordination scheme that I just came up with just a second. So that's like the ideal story, but clearly that's departing in a lot of ways from the platform setting. So there's a productive tension, I think, there between those two views, because a lot of why we lie is because there's not some like benevolent, uninterested candy allocator kind of figure here. They're like, these platforms are not they are not objective mechanism design coordinators. Now I'm forgetting the technical language. Designers. They're not uninterested designers, and so it does make sense for me, maybe individually, to capture a little bit of individual surplus to want to withhold or want to lay.
Because they don't want to tell the truth, but they want us to tell the truth. That's
right.
Pretty much what it boils down to, right? They want to tell. Yeah. They want us to tell. They want us to tell them how much we were willing to pay for a Twix, but they don't want to tell us how much they're willing to sell it for. That's
They also don't want to tell us how the degree to which they're willing to nudge us towards paying more for a Twix, for instance, because we're hungry at this particular time of day.
But can I just jump in? Just sorry, again, the anthropologist in me is exploding, because all of this presumes that we know, like if I buy a house, I don't necessarily, or I buy a Twix candy bar, like I don't know that I have an intrinsic sense of the intrinsic value of that candy bar, right?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Like I might know my budget, but right now I might feel like I'm having a really shitty day, so I'm going to spend a lot of money on that Twix bar, right? Like this is all right. Yeah. This is what anthropologists know about value, that there is no intrinsic value. So the efficient market hypothesis assumes that there are intrinsic values and they're rationally expressed and all that. So again, sorry, I feel like the work you did does much more than you realize. So from an anthropologist point of view, because the idea that you could construct interactions, right? This is mechanism design version of life, where agents like reveal the valuations that they truly have, right? So what's being operationalized is the idea that so-called truthful revelation of like what I think the value of
my internal preferences, my stable internal preferences. Yeah.
Right. That you can actually create the right conditions under which that will occur, right? That's what mechanism I learned this from you, right? So I was like, when I read that, we have a shared Google Doc that I literally put on the Google Doc, like, wow, this is an anthropologist's dream. Like if we could do this and do our research, it would be so much easier, right? Because people have all these conflicts. It's such a messy world when it comes to people's sense of value and valuation. It's very situational. Right. It's the way economic anthropologists like to talk to it, thanks to Arjuna Padarai, is that it actually emerges in exchange. Right. So it's in the moment, like when I go in to buy the Twix bar, depending how much money's in there are all these factors that come into play that at that particular moment, I'm willing to spend $5 and the next day I'll spend $10. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's so the idea that you could reveal these preferences is problematic. It seems to me like instead of saying that there's an inventory, right? That's like the profile of the viewer and the likelihood of that viewer clicking on an ad, right? That's the inventory. Again, I understood this from you. Instead of saying that that's managed through like techniques that optimize price discrimination or like the bidding strategies, so as to extract value, it seems to me that what they do is, and what I'm getting at is against the idea that value is extracted, because that means it exists prior. It seems to me that mechanism design is a way of generating forms of value that you can then make use of. But like I know that they theorize it as there are these intrinsic values that are truthful. We're going to create the conditions under which we can realize them. They will be expressed, and then we'll extract that. They might say that, but it feels like you're actually showing us, this is something this group has been very concerned about, how value is actually produced. And so we could tell a different story, which is that there's a prediction, right? They're doing predictive analytics. There's a prediction about the value of the inventory. And then based on that prediction, they create or generate or set up or design the conditions for realization of that value. So it's not extracted. It's actually, they actually create a whole situation where new value forms are produced. I feel like you helped me understand that, but then there are moments when you slip back into they're like, oh, this is corrupted. Like these aren't, I don't know, like, I don't know how to say this, but I feel like then you kind of slip back into I think you're actually showing us how they're creating new value forms. There isn't any value to be extracted. They are setting up the conditions under which it's produced in a very novel way. At least some time ago, it was novel. Does that make sense?
I think we take that point actually from Keen's work, partly for the work on automated neoliberalism, this shift to the imagination of what a market should look like, such that you can ultimately simulate that market. And yes, agree completely. And then I suppose what we're asking then is, how did this model of human intrinsic value that is part of like the game theory world just come to dominate everything?
Totally, yeah.
And so that's the story of value that's told, and it gets built for us, and then we become like these correlational agents that are, you know, effectively managed to perform our role within this simulation. So that's one part of it. On the other hand, there's this kind of there's this other political story, perhaps, that I think, you know, Lee and I have been thinking about a little bit, which is how, you know, different, for instance, legal standards might tune rationality as a way to satisfy a particular market formulation. So we've been thinking about how, for instance, you know, what in trademark law, there's this legal standard called the unwary purchaser. And we've been thinking about, you know, what are the cognitive and behavioral capacities attributed to the unwary purchaser and why? And we follow the work of this legal historian, Michael Petit, who says, oh, well, you know, the unwary purchaser is effectively given, you know, quite little in terms of cognitive capacity to discern between two different marks. And, you know, the rationale is that it's very protective of intellectual property, and it protects a particular bunch of incumbent manufacturers against competitors. So there's a political decision about market formulation that gets expressed through a particular account of human rationality. On the other hand, when you look at certain consumer standards of like the reasonable consumer, or even the boundedly rational reasonable consumer, all of a sudden you have quite a discerning consumer, right? Who's very capable of looking after their own interests. And this is operationalized in order to weigh against regulatory intervention. So on one hand, yes, these markets are being simulated according to this game theoretical account of how value ought to exist in humans. On the other hand, there's also a constant retweaking of like what the human is and what they can do and what their role is in order to build a particular market. Or maybe those two things are part of each other. That might be actually a better way of understanding that relationship. But yeah, I think it's not just the simulation of the rational agent. It's actually there's more to it than that.
Yeah, I think to add like a two-finger, or like to respond a little bit like to this, incredible conversation. I think you're right, Janet, that part of what we're telling a story of is this like constant like epistemological tug of war of like humans have stable internal preferences, says the theoretic tradition, and then like all the mess of the operational tradition comes in, and it's like, oh, I guess they don't, you know. And so and in one sense, like part of this paper too is like we are also talking to mechanism designers, so we want to like say like, okay, like let's take your worldview. Let's say humans do have stable internal preferences. What do you make of this entire other tradition then? Like, how do you talk about that? How do you think about that? I myself have reason to not find that idea, epistemological theory of like humans have stable internal preferences and we can sum them up and that's what welfare is, compelling. But there's still something very interesting to me about how internal to the story you see that slippage constantly. And maybe in your work you come across that all the time, but I think that was certainly something that I found really interesting about this project.
If I can jump in here, to me what is really interesting is that on the one hand, your story shows how data helps show the usefulness of ads and kind of monetize that. And so as Jen is saying, is the weight of data in some ways that allows this new value as money to emerge and to be thought of as constant, right? Because they can say, well, this is constant, or this is valuable because we have all this data to back it up and say, like, the profiles actually work. Look, there's all these correlations. And so we can use that to sort of sell and to convince people to make this claim that this is rational, and we have a way to price it up and to feed it into the system. But the same data seem to be also used to tweak the system itself. And therefore, once that sort of equivalent is established and saying we can monetize that, then to push up the prices in some ways. So in that sense, it works for me to think of this as exploitation, or it seems that data is actually pushing up constantly the prices through the model, allowing then Google or other platforms to in fact extract more of that value that they have helped create, right? So I think that is a fascinating bit that I thought I understood from your paper. But then I wasn't too sure how actually data worked in the whole system. So this is what I think it does, but I'm not sure if it's actually working that way. And so I really wanted to have a little bit more insights into how is data feeding on the two sides of the story. So on the one hand, to convince that these ads can be then monetized or are valuable in a monetary form, but also to then feed the system of the design itself, or the mechanism for pricing. Is it the same data? Are they different data points? How are they interacting? How is then Google or Facebook able to harness this in practice in the auction mechanisms?
Lee?
That's a lot. I mean, it's fascinating. I could talk about this for a really long time. I don't want to get into like too technical space. I mean, from my view, the entire basis of the advertising business is the production of documents and data. That's the whole thing. That when we say that it monetizes attention, what it does is create evidence of attention that can be taken as satisfactory to someone to say that I got what I paid for. And it can be different things, right? We can think about engagement, we can think about clicks, we can think about conversions, and there's raging debates about this stuff right now with respect to digital advertising, because many of the biggest providers are technically eliminating so-called third-party cookies, which are really the basis of a lot of the matching and the profiling of people's then feed into ad delivery choices and pricing and all the rest of it. And one of the things that's making really hard is the business of what they call attribution, which is making basically a causal claim about the effect of advertising. And it's one of the most fundamental dreams of the advertising business. How can we prove that our ads work, that they deliver a return on investment that we can measure and know? It's also it's fascinating that the industry is obsessed with it, and at the same time, parts of the industry try very hard to dodge it. I've come to start to thinking of it as like, I was talking to this fellow who studies dark matter and the search for dark matter through like big scientific programs, and it's a very similar sort of thing in that you've got this community of experts who's committed to this idea that advertising effects exist. It has to exist, but we can't find it. And we keep looking around the sky and we keep eliminating possibilities. But in fact, to make a legitimate claim about it, you have to account for every star in the galaxy, such that you can say it wasn't this that caused that effect, but it was this. And so it's an effort that's never going to succeed. They're never going to make like ironclad causal claims that advertising works. And look, we can show it. But the failures continue to generate more and more desire to produce more and more data to say that we can make this causal claim, because now we're eliminating all of the confounding variables. And what's funny to me is that operations researchers recognized this like 60 years ago and said like, this isn't actually going to work. But we're all too happy to take consulting money from ad agencies who wanted to find out this stuff very successfully. That's probably a bit of a diversion from your question, which was about how the data works. But that's such a big story. I mean, different in lots of different ways. A huge volume of it for the past 10 years is based on third-party cookies used to track the things people do online, to create behavioral profiles and to match those across contexts such that the inventory that becomes available when someone opens a page that serves ads can be, priced and served effectively. I mean, it doesn't work a lot of the time, but they make these bets hundreds of billions of times a day. And so it's less about like, puppet master manipulation stories, which you sometimes hear, and much, much more about, dueling over pennies and fractions of pennies, billions of times. But I mean, the whole, the economy of data collection, extraction, usage, analytics is just like huge and enrolls basically every company that you can think of today. Transaction processors, consumer electronics, retail, of course, and retailers are getting more and more into the advertising game right now as a result of the decline of third-party cookies. So with third-party cookies, meaning that your website can no longer see what people do on other websites, it means that companies who have a lot of information about their own customers that they can legally make a claim to without running afoul of these privacy rules have a big advantage. And so Walmart, the big pharmacies like CVS, they're all becoming ad tech companies as well to take advantage of that data, much like they did in the earlier days of database marketing. That was not a very specific answer, but that I feel like I've talked for too much now, so I'm going to stop. Also, I hear that I might.
This is where you plug your book. Your
plug my book.
Yeah, plug your book.
Okay, so I'm writing a book about that. Plug.
Can you say more?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I'm writing a book about the history of ad tech, which, but it's probably like people think it's weird because it takes place almost exclusively before the 2000s. So like I see ad tech as part of this longer developmental arc of computerization and the influence of management sciences and the ideology of optimization that they introduced or helped to really solidify in parts of the advertising business and parts of the advertising business that became the power center that companies like Google and Facebook express through their media buying and distribution aspects. I mean, that becomes like the engine of online advertising. And so it's, how operations researchers started consulting for ad agencies and big companies like DuPont who wanted to figure out how to measure advertising effectiveness and predict advertising effectiveness. And it created this whole sort of technical capacities, gravitated authority toward people who toward like parts of the business that were suitable for optimization or else supported optimization and so on. So it's basically how the advertising industry built up this apparatus of surveillance trying to respond to that question of like, does advertising work? Yeah.
Fantastic. You'll have to come back and
I'd be happy to. I have to finish it first.
Does anybody else have a?
I have a slightly, I'm not sure if it's a facetious question, but it does sort of follow on. So it's the question is, to what extent does are markets eating themselves? By which I mean is that markets are supposed to be dependent upon information, perfect information and so on. But what happens when a market, which is what's happening now, monetizes that information? When you start, it's cannibalizing itself by selling the information on which the market is dependent for its effectiveness and functionality and so on. And that seems to be, if we think about all the value, attempts to capture value and capture data and extract value from data holdings and things like that. This information is supposed to help markets function, but if you're monetizing it, what happens to the market?
Yeah, I guess that facetious question is a nice way of getting into how I would begin to understand or answer Fabio's like huge and hugely important question, which is that classic market theory has a very particular attendant theory of information and the purpose of it and the point of it in a market, which I'll very, dismissively sort of put in the bucket of price theory. And that really does not explain the role of information in these market-like mechanisms. I think of them as like ersatz markets or market machines. where information plays an extremely different function, in part because of the political economy of information that they're operating in, and that they're meant to effectuate the business of turning data about people into money for companies. So yeah, I think one way to maybe understand, I'll have to think a long time about Fabio's question about how mechanism design relates to like the datafication of everything, because I think there are so many thousands of ways that they relate. Bye, Lee. But one way is a little bit in this like, snake eating its tail, or like a fractal, like you put people in these information-rich environments to produce information to simulate a price, but then you take that information, it's like a differential relationship. And then you take that information and use that to tune the next market exchange, and then you use that completely enriched bundle to like also make a prediction of how people like that other actor might act in a future market about a future product that's related to the product that you're bidding on right now, and like so on and so forth forever and ever. Yeah.
Yeah, just to jump in on that. Wait, Jake, did you want to say something?
I mean, I have a bit to say about the same point, but I'm happy to
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I suppose that the sort of auto masticated and digested market is like the business model here, and it's this funny thing where I think what has come out of some of the regulatory efforts around pushing platforms now is that there's a lot of interest in getting platforms to disclose the relationship between content, user data, and economic value. And keep the opacity around that seems to be at the absolute kernel of what the platforms need to protect. So, there's all this discussion about transparency, but when it comes to transparency around how you like the economic value you can extract from a piece of content, no platform will expose that. They resist very, very intensely. You can read through the sort of submissions that are made to the various policy proposals that have been happening in Australia around the news media bargaining code. You look at what's happening in there was the French press agents case last year, where the Article 15 of the DSM creates this new property right in hyperlinks that the platforms are compelled to negotiate with the press agencies for license, and antitrust law has already said, you have to deal. You're not allowed to just ignore them. So they're dealing over how much money the platform is going to have to give to the content producers, and the content producers are saying, we can't make a deal because Google won't tell us how much our content is worth. So how are we supposed to accept or reject their offer? And Google will just say, no, we accept the 500 million euro fine for refusing to divulge that information. And we will accept the 2 million euro a day fine for every day that we don't do it, right? And it demonstrates the value to these companies of controlling and like keeping secret the capacity of the market to eat itself, the capacity to control this derivative information market over the relationship between content.
Yeah, and it's the derivative and derivative, which is why I call them market machines or assets, but they're not market. I don't know what a market is, but this isn't one.
I'm exploding here because this is while you were talking. And Kian's question really got me thinking. This is like, it makes me think of derivative markets, like they eat themselves. Like you need to produce debt to fuel the market, and the more debt and the more risk you're producing, the more secondary markets you have, right? And the more value is produced in those secondary markets, right? Based on the more risk and debt we can produce, which is why the subprime mortgage collapse will happen again. It's based on some other something, whatever, right? So because that's what secondary markets are. Right?
Yeah.
Like the idea, right? So I guess that was actually the other thing that came up in my notes was like, there was a part where you talk about how sociologists and economic historians, show that like, these wouldn't, like markets have sort of been automated away, would be one way to think about it. And I was wondering, like, can't we just maybe say this is simply what markets are today? right? Like they're the outcome of engineered automated decision systems. You could say this about some financial markets, right? For the optimization of
all the
particular
financial
parameters.
markets. Yeah.
Right. And so one like, you can imagine someone responding negatively and saying, no, because this involves these private mechanisms that, like Google, right, or a big tech, of like managing resource allocation, right, or price discovery. And then I would respond, but like contract law and other administrative and private mechanisms like have always been part of the institutional apparatus of markets. Like the efficient market hypothesis is always lurking there, but it's never realized. You know, I know this is an old, actually just a little plug here. I don't know if Natasha Schul is online, but is still online. She's online and she sent me a text message, like she's screaming in her apartment in New York City, raising the similar question about like this idea of the rational liberal subject is like, it's never been the underpinning of markets. We tell ourselves that, and certainly, you know, go into the hallways of any economics department, you know, in the United States, certainly you would hear that, right? But yeah, so I guess I felt like once again, you showed us something is sort of that you're not claiming that's big, it's really big. It's like, this is actually what these markets are today, you know? So yeah, extremely important.
Emma, Andrew, Lila, Linda, other thoughts or questions before we run out of time with, you know, continuing on these points?
I guess I have a question to go back to what you were saying, Jake, earlier about, or a moment ago, about Google not being willing to disclose. Oh shoot, my computer might die. Okay, here we go. Questions surrounding how different things are being evaluated. And I guess my question is, do you think that that's about proprietary anxieties? Or do you think it's about not total uncertainty in this like highly iterative process where data is being constantly feedback looped, and that actually something of the occlusion of that process is actually part of what creates certainty on the outside? In other words, uncertainty internal to Google, or its unwillingness to share those things, is less about some kind of proprietary claim and more so about the ways in which protecting against kind of popular knowledge of that uncertainty is generative of certainty on the other side, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really insightful, and I think that's right. And when I talk to friends who work at Google who talk, you know, off the record, what I take away from it is that Google is a very insecure company, and the ways in which they make money are kind of fragile, and things, as you're saying, these kinds of disclosures might not necessarily be so much about protecting a particular value generating tool as rather protecting from the exposure of the fragility of that tool to some sort of regulatory or competitive intervention. Yeah,
I will say there are interesting instances where companies are actually incentivized to make claims about the value of things like their data and their user bases. So I have a friend and colleague who's a tax scholar, and she looks a lot at moments when companies are bankrupt or they're trying to get bridge loans, and they will sometimes affirmatively put forward the value of these assets in order to get money from banks. And so that's actually another like interesting counterpoint to the like Google being willing to pay fines, is there are, and she's been able to find really, really interesting instances of companies affirmatively going to banks and being like, we also have this other thing that can serve as collateral. Yeah, so not to undermine, I think, that point, which I think is really right, but yeah, there are kind of these other little weird instances where disclosure happens and where they also kind of tell about the value.
there's also this funny thing about like the marshalling of privacy discourse as a way to protect this derivative market.
I'm writing about that right now.
Yeah, there's these sort of bad faith privacy arguments, but they're not necessarily all bad faith when you think about
Writing about an ACLU case right now.
what the consumer model of privacy actually is, you know. And so if regulators are pushing to say, look, we need data transparency in this environment, and then you know, which will equalize or undo the business model of renting out access to data in specific moments in order to price specific ad inventories, well, then it's strange that like the big platforms are arguing as against the big media companies. Oh, no, this would be a privacy disaster if we had to open up our user data to everyone else. And I don't think regulators know how to resolve that. It sounds like Salomé might have some ideas soon, but yeah, that's like, it's such a interesting rhetorical deployment of these concepts.
I'll potentially make a more depressing insight that those rhetorical concepts in the United States, where we give extremely strong historic doctrinal protection to certain forms of civil liberties that are then weaponized by companies to undermine attempts by the administrative state to regulate them, has a long and very successful history in this country. So I am interested in trying to nip that in the bud as much as I can, but, and I'm not alone, other legal scholars here are on it, but yeah, I mean, it's like a tactic that is already being marshaled and that I expect will be marshaled far more as they start to, as administrators and regulators start to try to impose market discipline on that derivative market through forms of regulation and accountability.
Yeah, please share your article with us, Salomé, when you.
It is very nascent, but yes.
Yeah.
But a great point that you have just raised, which I haven't realized before, is that we often think of Google as a monopoly in some ways because of its ability to harness data in many ways. But if the data then becomes part of the mechanism design itself, can we also see for that reason as particularly vulnerable? In the same way that you can use Twitter bots to create new narratives if you have enough of them. Then you could use potentially, if you had enough data, or if you could feed enough false data into the system, could you use that to trick the system design into pricing it completely, differently? And I'm thinking about this from the perspective of, the use of automated systems on markets in financial trading, where, you have these systems that they trade so fast that you could potentially completely crash a market if you go into a loop, or the use of Russian bots on Twitter that can in fact generate all sorts of narratives if there's enough of them in certain ways, or even certain human that if they're able to create enough impressions, they can get then pricing completely different. And that's what the fake news generators in some places do, right? They're able to get pricing down because they're able to create data or ads that supposedly is more effective, but in fact it's still them all clicking on the same data, the same advertisement in order to push. So in other words, is mechanism design creating its own vulnerability because it's data driven in ways that is maybe not anticipated by these companies?
I mean, it feels like you're describing ad fraud, broadly construed. Which
possibly, I don't know.
I mean, as Leila said in the class, it was just like click farms. Like I think that's right. But then you have to realize that there's also a whole industry of fraud detection that relies on data about phony data, and and no one knows whether it works or not. Salomé and I were, we were at Cornell Tech together working under Helen Nissenbaum, and she has this project about obfuscation, and she has these browser add-ons called like Ad Nauseam and Agnostic, which effectively make your browser click on every ad it sees, right? As a political gesture against personalization, but there is this ongoing question, is this fraud? What does it work? Is it detectable? Have the platforms already detected it and just sort of eliminated that in the, as Lee was talking about, what's really important, which is the metrics that they then give to their ad buyers, which is the thing that matters the most because that's who's paying. No one really knows. It's another example of no one's able to answer it, and there's just an assumption that Google's ad fraud detection is sophisticated enough to be able to deal with it, but no one knows.
I mean, this the argument that or the mobilization of concerns over privacy protection seems particularly pernicious because, if anything, it seems very clear that individuals are functionally irrelevant here. It's about relations, right? It's about distributed personhood or something like this, right? So that I'm like, particularly because we have legal scholars in the room, like how is the law kind of confronting this fundamental problematic that we have a set of assumptions baked into law that actually totally can't account for the novel distributions that seem to sit at the center of the problematic that all of us here, and you all in particular, are interested in understanding.
Well, that's a very neat encapsulation
paper on this.
Yeah, but also the more general question or tension that you've raised is like just Jake and I's research agendas that we will be working on inside of the Legal Academy for a long time, because it's a big problem. I mean, yeah, there are like fundamentally, I mean, the way Jake would put it, I guess to paraphrase him, he can do it for himself, is like the subject theorized by the law is very different from the subject theorized by these systems. And that fails us across a bunch of contexts.
But that's
in the narrower category of data. Yeah, I mean, I think that it allows for these kinds of weaponization of privacy claims that currently in the law are very much modeled on individual data subject rights. It allows them to be effectively weaponized by companies that have eroded the substance of what that right was meant to, the substance of the interests that right was meant to protect. And marshal them as anti-regulatory arguments in courts that in the US are very ready to be hearing anti-regulatory arguments. Maybe not against Facebook, everybody's mad at Facebook, but everybody else. And that's not just like a conceptual challenge for the law, that's like a material problem if we want to regulate the information economy. So that's not an answer, but it's certainly something that I think people like Jake and I are extremely attentive to as like a legal problem, as a conceptual legal challenge.
Yeah, it's pretty much the basis of all my work in this space at the moment, is precisely that problem.
Yeah, just to add to it, I mean, I'm sort of tying up the remarks I've been making sort of all along during our discussion, but similarly, you know, the way the market is theorized, under contract law, et cetera, is also problematic. I'm just repeating what I've been saying all along, but Linda and I had a beginnings of an exchange when we read your article about distributed agency. And so, you know, my go-to is Michel Calon's work on this, and but I never thought about it sort of, I'm sure he has, but sort of from the perspective of a legal scholar. I've only thought about it from the perspective of, you know, an economic sociologist or an economic anthropologist. But coming to terms with distributed agency is a very different problematic, right? And a fascinating one. So yeah.
The encounter of the economic registers of these problems and the legal registers of these problems is its own kind of puzzle, I think. You know, and in this mechanism design paper, we're operating, I suppose, in the economic register. And then in some of the work I've been doing since, we're looking at the encounter of the theorized legal subject in these economic operationalizations, and what is the product? Why do we rely on these theorized legal subjects to try and regulate these economic environments on which they have no empirical connection, no purchase, no theoretical relationship at all? And so, you know, once again, what's the political work being done? What's the market formulation being constructed? Who's it benefiting, and why is like at the heart of all these things for me, but also for Salomé and Lee and a few others of us who are working in the same time and place and became obsessed with these questions.
It's great. Yeah.
And I felt you were going to say something.
Well, it seems particularly fascinating. This just occurs to me because if that legal subject in some ways never actually existed, whatever this new distributed subject is seems to be more actualized in a strange way than that historically autonomous. You know what I'm sort of like grappling with the actual kind of implications of tracing out empirically what's going on for both like revealing the kind of initial fiction that's grounded law on the one hand, and there does seem to be some suggestion that these socio-technical systems are actually materializing and generating value, however that's construed, of a subject that might be more actualized in the current context. That's very not very clear, but a light bulb just went off in my.
Salomé, I think that was your like quite glib contribution to the conclusion of this mechanism design paper, actually, where you're sort of like, which subject is actually the one that makes sense, that works in the world. Yeah, and I thought you made that point really nice.
Glib. I love a glib conclusion.
We had a similar discussion, right, with Keane last October about the user or the construction of the user. So he was saying subject, but yeah, that discussion was around his kind of working around the enclave. Because yeah, it's quite a contrast what we're talking about now to say some other economic sociologists, a couple that we know, who kind of define this relationship through a barter exchange. Users and platforms, Facebook, for example. I barter my time, Facebook kind of barters its whatever utility, but yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that's what we're talking about, but it's a much more compelling narrative that we're putting together for sure.
Well, Lee and my new paper is called Laws, Consumers and Platform Users. And it's very much about what's the legal construction of the user, what's the advertising industry's construction of the user, and what falls out when you sort of try and mash them together like the regulatory world does. And if anyone wants to read a draft and supply comments, we're finally getting it ready for submission. So we'd love for people to offer some feedback.
Happy
Send
to.
it my way.
Yeah.
All right. And it seems that in this case, you have this fascinating discrepancy between users as me who clicks on an ad and users as those who buy and sells ads on the platform. And so you have this different sort of layers that make it, fascinating in many ways. When you think about the mechanism design itself, there's multiple users of different kinds that do different things in it. And so reconciling the value there is an interesting question. I think we're running out of time. So really wanted to thank you, Salomé and Jake and Lee for this fantastic discussion and conversation, and thank everybody else on the group for pitching in and being so forthcoming with thoughts, ideas, and comments. And we really enjoyed reading your work, and we hope that you have more coming along the pipeline, and you'll keep us in mind once you want to share it or give us some food for thought.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.